With week 1 nearly in the books, there are quite a few players that had great debut games and burst onto the scene with a bang. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had 138 rushing yards and a touchdown in a victory for the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. Undrafted free agent James Robinson had 90 yards from scrimmage, including this incredible hurdle, which helped the Jaguars upset the Colts. But what if I told you there was a running back who had a debut better than both of those guys, and then did nothing else for the rest of his career and was out of the league less than 2 years later? This is the true definition of a one-game wonder. This is the story of Larry Mason. You're probably asking yourself how something like this is even possible. How can a guy minus a career-ending injury rush for 133 yards and 2 touchdowns in his first game ever, and then never score another rushing touchdown for the rest of his career? Well, we need some context, because the situation was far from that of an ordinary season. Larry Mason played for a few years in the United States Football League and the Canadian Football League. He even scored 7 rushing touchdowns in 1984 with the Jacksonville Bulls. But he couldn't find his way onto an NFL roster, and after getting cut from training camp during the 1987 season with the Cleveland Browns, it seemed as though his career was over. Then a little thing known as the strike happened. After the first 2 games in the 1987 season, the players went on strike. Week 3 was cancelled, and weeks 4 through 6 were played with replacement players, otherwise known as scabs. I talked a bit about this in an earlier video of mine, where I discussed the fact that the league considered playing a split season that year to negate the effects of the scab games. Check that out in the upper right corner. Now that every team needed to find replacement players, the Browns decided to bring back Mason, and it made sense. They knew what he could do, seeing as he was just there, he was good enough to make it to the final cuts, and he averaged over 4 yards per carry in both the USFL and the CFL. They knew he could play. Mason was set to make his NFL debut on October 4th, 1987 against the New England Patriots. And in a 20-10 victory, Mason balled out. He led the league in rushing that week, picking up 133 yards, with 106 of those yards coming in the second half, and scoring 2 touchdowns. He averaged over 4 yards per carry, scoring both of Cleveland's touchdowns. And this win was a critical one for the Browns, as they finished the season atop the AFC Central by 1 game over the Houston Oilers. Without Mason's efforts, they might not wind up winning the division. Head coach Marty Schottenheimer was impressed, saying that Larry was familiar with the offense. And Mason was feeling pretty confident. He said, "In the fourth quarter, I was relaxed, and doing what I knew I could do." Mason also said after that he hoped he could get into the NFL after the strike ends, saying, "I know I can do it." And it made sense why he said that. He had one of the greatest debuts by a running back in NFL history, and that is not an exaggeration. Mason is one of just 5 running backs ever to run for over 130 yards and 2 touchdowns in his first ever NFL game. Unfortunately for him, despite this incredible performance, it would not work out that way. Over the next 2 scab games, he didn't do a whole lot. Against the Oilers, while he had a receiving touchdown, he had just 5 rushing yards. And against the Bengals the following week, his numbers were fairly pedestrian, picking up a somewhat nice 69 yards on 20 carries. The good news for him was that he was one of the roughly 50 or so replacement players that was actually retained. The bad news was that he would not get another carry for the rest of the season. The Browns had lots of talent in the running game, including Ernest Biner, who ran for over 1,000 yards a few years before in 1985, and Kevin Mack, who would go on to make the Pro Bowl for the second time in 3 years that season. Mason's talents were no longer needed. In 1988, Mason wound up on the Green Bay Packers, but once again didn't do a whole lot. He ran for 194 yards and was out of the league by the end of the season. Mason had 401 rushing yards in his entire career, and 133 of them came in his debut. This meant that roughly 1/3 of his career rushing yards came in the first game of his career. When you consider the circumstances of the strike and whatnot, it makes a bit more sense, but it's amazing that a guy with that much talent and that strong of a debut just couldn't get it going in the end. What's the biggest takeaway from a story like this? At the end of the day, if a rookie has a great first game, that's great, but it's just 1 game. There's still many more games in their career to be played. Some who have strong debuts, like Marshall Faulk running for 143 yards and 3 touchdowns, keep it up for their entire career and wind up in Canton someday. And some, like Larry Mason, fizzle out and become mere footnotes in the century-long history of the NFL. Be sure to check out Twitch every Tuesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. link in the description below. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.